tell my younger self as far as writing stuff? Because a lot of this stuff is organic. You learn it as you go.
It's strange. It's nothing I ever expected.
I want to tell my stories by eliciting emotion in my audience.
So it's an organic process. They sort of layer on top of each other. Each one makes the next layer more obvious to me.
This whole thing could not have gone any smoother.
I usually say squat only in groups of 3. I like the batches, like squat, squat, squat.
Look, guys, this one's not going to be like normal. It's just not.
Welcome to The Writer's Journey. I'm your host, Lauren Moore, and with me is the Melith, who is Kayleen Williams.
That's a big difference. It's like, are you talking or are you doing? What's happening here?
We still have all the pets that think, oh, it's time to eat. It doesn't matter if it's 4 a.m.
My name is Walt, and this is Coffee and Concepts on Keystroke Medium.
I love that intro. It never gets old. And welcome to The Writer's Journey. We are swinging in with an AMA you don't want to miss. Tad Williams, a self-proclaimed, scarred and vengeful dwarf, is a California-based fantasy author whose work has helped shape the fantasy genre as we know it today. He's here for a chat and to answer all of not just ours, but your burning questions. Let's just throw some gasoline on that pyre and light her up. Welcome, people in the chat. Golf clap of appreciations to Bard of today. Good job being first. Tad.
Yes, hello.
Thank you for being here and joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And hello to Ken Britz, our co-host for today, our special extra co-host. And we have Patricia Gillum, Bard of today, Rick Partlow, and Jay Clifton Slater is here live in our audience. And we're excited, Tad. We've got lots of questions for you prepared, but we especially want to get questions from the audience today while we have the chance to have you live with us on the interwebs and hear what you have to say.
It's all good.
The timing is really cool because we have Ken Britz is a huge fan of yours. He's been
Am I really?
Oh, I love
look
to
how
see
old
those.
Look how worn she is.
I love to see those well-handled volumes. That always makes me so happy.
It's not just me reading it; it's how many people I passed it to say you've got to read this book.
Now that's a slightly different issue, but since I only got paid once. No, I'm just kidding. That's fine. Hand them around. That's what I do with the books I love too. Absolutely.
Yes.
And over here, I'm a brand new fan because of this show. But I started reading your first series, and I'm on book 1, and I'm enjoying getting into the world, into the characters, and as an editor, I'm really impressed by the writing. I'm like, man, this guy is good. I cannot wait to get into this today, so I can learn from him. Teach me your ways.
Well, thank you. I think I'd like to think. I mean, it is a frighteningly long time in the past when I wrote that. I'd like to think I'm maybe a better writer. I'm certainly a more careful writer in one sense than I used to be. I was running about 6 adjectives per sentence back in those days, and I think I throttled it back a little bit since then, but I was very much in my Thomas Pynchon, Tom Robbins, Hunter S. Thompson phase, if you can imagine all of those applied to fantasy writing. So I'd like to think that I'm a bit of a cleaner writer now, but I also look back at that book and I go, yeah, no, I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of those books.
Well, how'd you get started writing back in the day?
Well, let me see if I can make this as quick and abbreviated as possible, because it's a long, long story, which is basically the whole first part of my life. But in a nutshell, I always did artistic kinds of things. That was kind of my aim in life all along. It was just a question of what I was going to what I was going to do. So I did illustration and cartooning. I did theater. I played in a rock and roll band and wrote music and did a whole bunch of stuff like that for years and years, all through school. And when I first got out of school, but towards that kind of turn into my early 20s, it became clearer and clearer, especially because I was still working several jobs at the same time, that I wanted to do something that I could time shift, although we didn't have that term back then, but something that I could time shift so that I could do it like when I came home at 3 o'clock in the morning from one of my various jobs. Because it was always with things like being in a band or stuff like that, there was oftentimes the problem of you had to get a bunch of people and they all had to coordinate. And to be honest, in the early 20s, you know, everybody was either drinking or they just broken up with their boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, you know, and it was always like chaos trying to get 5 or 6 people together. So I got more and more interested in doing things on my own time. And somewhere along there, and again, I'm abbreviating dramatically, I moved in with my first wife who had cats. And although I've always lived with dogs, I had never lived with cats before. So I was kind of stunned by the whole thing. This is an old routine of mine, so I won't go through it for you. But I just was stunned by the idea that, you know, the dog human bargain was so basic and the cat human bargain was so questionable. You know, it's like dogs, they treat you like God if you do anything, as long as you feed them. You know, you are their absolute hero. Whereas the cats, you know, you feed them, you take care of them, you pet them, you protect them, and they kind of occasionally look at you and go like, yeah, you look sort of familiar.
I recognize you today, human. Good job.
You can sit until I'm ready for it, you know, that kind of thing. So anyway, as a result of that, I kind of in my head started playing around with an idea of how would cats see the world if they had a whole world view, and what kind of mythology would cats have, and just playing games in my head because I came from a background of reading a lot of fantasy and science fiction. And then as it turned out, and in part because I lived in a very small apartment complex with another writer who was in one of the other apartments, who was a very nice guy who was a published writer, Ron Hansen, and was teaching at Stanford at the time, I went, you know, maybe I could try that. So I wrote my first book and was lucky enough to sell that. And then they asked me what else I might want to write. And I told them, which was a historical novel set in 18th dynasty Egypt. And they looked at me like I was insane. And they said, you know, essentially, do you want to go back to the gutter? You know, we've saved you. We've pulled you out here, you know, but we only publish science fiction and fantasy. So I said, well, there is kind of like this thing that I've been wanting to write ever since the second generation of Tolkien imitators came along. And I'd like to kind of take a crack at the big epic fantasy. And that was the Dragonbone Chair. So that's kind of how it happened, made as small as possible. But basically it was all about, I knew I had to do something creative. I work well with others, but I don't, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't work well as a minion for others. You know what I mean? I can get along with other people just fine, but I did not like having stupid bosses, and I had a bunch of those. So I realized early on that I had to do something where I could be my own boss, get up when I wanted to get up, wear what I wanted to wear, but more importantly, do something creative. So that's just kind of where I aimed it. And I was fortunate enough at that point to sell that book before any of the other things happened. So if things had happened differently, I might be an editorial cartoonist now, or have been doing layouts for animation or something. Who knows? But that's what I did, and I'm glad in a large sense, because that I kind of realized later on that I'd always been a reader and a storyteller, and that was a deep, deep part of my makeup. So that's what kind of led to it eventually, without me even realizing that that was maybe where I was fated to go.
Now, speaking of fate, we had on, I think it was 2 years ago, we had on your editor, Betsy,
yes,
from DAW Books, and she said, you have to have him on your show. This guy's hilarious.
Because I'm so quiet and restrained. She knew it would be a nice antidote.
Fantastic writer. I mean, we like to kind of like, most of our audience, there are other authors too, authors and editors and book creators. So we're always like looking to kind of like dig into the topics and to dig in the hows and the whats. So so Betsy said you have to have Tad on. How did you get connected with DAW Books?
Okay, that's actually a story I can tell fairly quickly. It's fairly straightforward. When I had finished my first novel, I knew nothing about publishing. I had books. That's all I had. I had the books that I had collected over the years, mostly used because I was poor. And
don't disuse Bookman.
Sorry,
because it don't disuse Bookman.
Yeah, no, not at all, not at all. And that's basically, so I went and looked at the books and I said, okay, who's publishing this kind of stuff these days? And there were two that jumped out. One was Del Rey at the time, and the other was DAW. So because Del Rey had just had some successes with a couple of things, I think Thomas Covenant and some others, I sent the manuscript off to Del Rey and they sent it back to me so quickly. I think it passed itself in the mail. There was like a brief moment of quantum hijinks of some kind. It was just boom, like that. Anyway, leaving that aside and my kind of humorous feud with Judy Del Rey after that, I then sent it to DAW. What I did not know at the time was that DAW was a comparatively very small publishing company. They were connected to a larger publishing company at the time, New American Library, but they themselves were a small family-owned company. Betsy's dad, Don Walheim, had started it. He was still there at that point, although not very well. Betsy's mom, Elsie, and Betsy and Sheila, and even Betsy's husband, Peter. So it was a small group that were working there and a couple of other people. I didn't know this, so I sent my manuscript off, and after several months, I still hadn't heard anything back. So I decided, okay, I really want to know if they've got my manuscript or, if they're looking at it, or is it just propping up a desk with a short leg or something like that? So I'm so ashamed of this. I actually wrote to them and said, well, we've had terrible floods out here in California. This was in the middle of a historic drought, by the way. This was like 8 years of drought. I said, we've had terrible flooding here in California, and my basement is flooded. Of course, nobody in California has basements. It just doesn't happen. But my basement is flooded, and my only copy of the manuscript has been destroyed. Could you please, I'll send you the money, but could you please photocopy off the copy that you have and send it to me and I'll pay for it. Figuring that way, at least somebody had to go get it out from under that desk with the short leg. That was what I didn't realize until later is that at the time, Peter Stamfel, Betsy's husband, who is a wonderful human being and actually kind of very well-known freak folk musician himself, they had the kind of copying machine that you had to put each piece in separately. They didn't have one of those bulk feeders. So poor Peter, on the basis of this absolutely larcenous plea, had to go and page by page copy my entire manuscript and send them to me. And it took me years after I'd become a DAW author before I would admit that to him. I was so ashamed when I found out. But anyway, so then after a certain period longer, and maybe that helped, I don't know, Peter never copped to it one way or the other, but after a certain period, they sent me a thing and said, we've decided we're going to publish your book, et cetera, which, as anybody who's been a writer and has gotten that letter knows, that's, it may not be having your first child or getting married, but it's right up there in terms of memorable day, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the beginning of the relationship that, still going on. I'm still with DAW. Betsy and I are still buddies. As a matter of fact, she's mad at me because I was supposed to call her this week and other things came up. But so, yeah, that was 1984, 85. So, yeah, I've been working with Betsy and Sheila, but Sheila is now in the process of retiring. I've been working with Betsy since then. So, yeah, it's been a very fertile relationship for I think for them, certainly for me.
Wow, 40 years of working together and growing and getting those books out there. And I keep reading on the internet that those 40 years helped to kind of shape the fantasy genre that we have today. And, kind of listening to this first book, I'm not too surprised. Just because, my imaginations are really firing, as I kind of hear about the characters in the world. Ken, so you are one of those authors. You are a science fiction fantasy author, definitely science fiction.
Working on the fantasy part.
Yeah, working on the fantasy part. But a science fiction author who's been inspired. Tell us about what reading Tad's books were for you. as an author and a reader?
It was definitely probably one of my favorite series. Kind of the post, Tolkien, as you said, there's a lot of clones out there. And back, if you remember Walden Books when it was still around.
Yeah.
I don't remember how many times I've gone to the same Walden Books, to the same science fiction and fantasy section, looking for a really good fantasy book. And the Dragonbone chair was there. And this copy is so old, it says coming in 1992, Stone of Farewell.
Yeah.
Which is the second book.
I know. Yeah, I should get that done someday.
You should finish that one.
I should finish it. Yeah. I'm very glad to hear it. I mean, one of the things that is always both enlightening and, I don't know, not frustrating, but it's always an eye opener to realize on the thin edge of things where people make decisions about books. Because I've had so many people tell me, oh, I saw this Michael Whalen cover and I said, oh, I've got to buy that book. And then, then they said, as it turned out, I loved your book or whatever, and you're feeling like, oh, good. But geez, what if I hadn't had a Michael Whalen cover, which was not common back in those days. Michael was only doing, a select few.
Absolutely. I want to say that the cover did sell it to me.
Michael has done brilliant work, not just for me. I was fortunate enough to have him on quite a few covers, but Michael has just been good for every single person. And shout out for Michael, that he also is one of the few artists that I know of who reads the books before he does the painting, or he reads whatever state the book's in. He really wants to know. He wants to do it, with knowledge of what the author's intent was, rather than, some writers, and it's not always their fault. They may get a late assignment, but a lot of writers will work off of, just a summary or So, Michael always said, no, I'm going to read it because I have to know what the characters are, who they are that I'm painting, because he was very into that idea. So, yeah.
I think I definitely feel, I know this cover displays it, but the Green Angel Tower, I think 100% captures all of the characters.
That is a gorgeous that is a gorgeous cover, and I was so glad that we were able to do a wraparound where we could do two different versions of it and everything, because I just thought Michael's work was so gorgeous. We wanted to use it every way we could. So
yes, and your Empire of Grass, the new one, is just
I know. So, well, as
amazing.
long as we're talking about Michael, I know people constantly ask me, they go, well, why did, what's going on with the new series? Why isn't Michael doing the rest of the paintings, et cetera, et cetera? So if anybody wants to ask me about that, we might as well do that now.
I was going to ask because I want to get a special edition of with more Michael Whalen covers.
Yeah. No, I'd love to see it too. It was, and I have to be careful here, not because there's anything bad that I'm saying or dangerous that I'm saying, but because I'm talking about things where I don't know all the internal workings completely. But basically, in a nutshell, over the last few years, DAW Books has been in the process of finding a new, I mentioned that they had sort of a parent company relationship with originally New American Library, then Penguin, Random House, etc. And so they came to the parting of the ways with Penguin Random House, which really should have been called Random Penguin. I mean, come on.
Missed opportunity.
Right? It really is. But anyway, they came to the parting of the ways with Penguin Random House. And one of the reasons was that Penguin Random House was sort of pulling the reins back, I think, on certain things in terms of expenditures. And Michael is one of the most expensive cover artists in the field. Big shock. That's like saying, Tom Cruise or somebody like that is one of the most, expensive actors. Well, there's a reason, they bring it in. So anyway, they basically just sort of laid down the law and said, well, we're only going to, allow this much, which had happened once before. It happened during the Shadow March books too. We actually changed artists in midstream on that one too. But we did it in a way that was less obvious. Whereas this one, I just said, well, then let's just go for a totally different look. Let's not pretend, let's not try to soft soap anybody that it's Michael Whalen, but not, let's just do something different. And that's what we did. So I was just as frustrated as the many readers who have contacted me and said, "Why isn't Michael doing? Why did you throw Michael out?" like I had personally gone to Michael's house and said, "Never do another book cover for me again." Michael is a lovely guy, an incredibly talented guy, and every time he's done a book for me, I have felt extremely pleased with the final results and very honored, and had a good time working with him. When I would pass notes back and forth and all that. So yeah, that was not my choice. It just happened that way, but. It's business. It's the world we live in. It's the billionaire manipulated scene that we all are on the edges of, hoping to grasp a few little fragments for ourselves. So that's how it worked. And I am
I'd still be willing to get a wraparound cover for.
I would love to see
Into the Narrow Dark and your final novel.
I would love to see it, and we may talk to Michael about it. At the same time, though, another artist is doing a really nice series of special books. They did the Dragonbone Share already, Donato, and they're going to be probably doing the whole series as well, and his very fine paintings. So just a brief plug on that. But anyway, so that's what happened, and that's, as I've often told people, that's the first thing when you get into the field. You are excited if they even just reply to you, when you send something in and they say, well, thank you for your submission, but we don't really have blah, blah, whatever they say. You're like, but they talked to me. And then, later on, and Ken, you probably know this, when you sell a book and you're like, I am God, there's nothing like me. Nothing can stop me now. Well, as you go along in the field, and especially once you make a decision that that's going to be your full-time income and how you make a living, the conversations and the milestones become political. And they're about things like, how much money are they putting into the budget for marketing? How much time are they giving me? How much are they going to push this? What are they putting it out against in the rest of the field? All that kind of stuff. You start to get more into the politics of the whole thing. And it's not as much fun, honestly, as the early days when it's just like, if I could get published, my life would be perfect, and now you're at the stage, it's like, well, if I could get another 15,000 on the marketing budget, boring, but that's where it's at. As I said, especially when it's your job, when it's your career, when you're supporting, your home and family and all that other stuff with it. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, readers miss they see what you have, right? They see the world, they read it, but they miss the work that went behind it, the drafts, and then the marketing that comes in.
Well, but
it's behind it.
Absolutely. But if we're doing it right, that's the way it should be. It's the same thing. It's like ballet or any number of other things. If you see the work in anything other than the effortlessness and the ease with which the performer performs, then you're doing it, they're not doing it right. So you try and mask all of that as much as possible so that it looks like this book couldn't be different. There's no way you could change anything. I mean, we don't succeed. I don't know anybody who's ever 100% succeeded, but that's your aim, is to make something that just seems to flow out as though it already existed, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, talent plays a role, and luck and timing play a role, but being able to stick with it and work through the hard and then the boring parts, that is what eventually, like, you push through that and you get to success. So I'm listening to your book one. It's your first book you've ever written, and the storytelling is very strong. And I've written a little bit and I want to get better. So my question is, how did you learn? I'm going to ask this question. How do you learn to write? I know, like, everyone's like, oh, I read, and it just comes out natural. But come on, how'd you hone your craft that well, man? I'm really impressed.
I wish there was a simple answer. Yeah. Obviously, yes, a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you have a background in reading, if you are somebody who, this is going to be really interesting to me, actually, just a brief digression. It's going to be really interesting to me to see if we have a different generation of writers who grew up on non-paper books and just the effect that has on the brain and the creativity. I don't know if it will have any effect or not, but certainly for us back in those days, reading was our everything. Now, I mean, we had radio, TV, movies. I'm not talking about the steam age here or anything, but you know, definitely Deborah, my wife, was my British publisher, so she's also a book person. I mean, we both developed our personalities as young people from reading. That was who we, you know, that was where we found ourselves. That was where we found like minds. That was where we began to check the way we felt about things against the rest of the world and went, okay, other people feel that way too. Especially for my wife, that was big because she was in a small town in England, you know, which was very old fashioned and parochial in some ways. And she was able to find in books, no, other people have experienced this before. You know, it's not just me. But back to the idea of how do you write? One thing that's really important that I always talk about is to cast your net extremely wide. Especially if you want to write genre fiction of some kind. And genre fiction can be any different genre, you know, from romance, westerns, crime, true crime, thrillers, you know, it doesn't matter. But the thing is that if you only read the sort of thing that you're trying to write, you are of necessity going to be very narrow. You are going to be enacting changes based on other people's changes to old formulas, right? It's the same thing happened in comic books, where we went from a generation of people who learned how to draw in life drawing classes to a generation of people who learned to draw from drawing other comic book artists, comic book art. And I think very strongly you have to go back to the well. That was another complaint I had with not Tolkien, but with the Tolkien imitators that we mentioned earlier, was that very few of them at that time were going back to the well that Tolkien had brought stuff up from, the well of folklore and myth and all that stuff. And they didn't realize that Tolkien was making choices of the things that he wanted to use, that there was not some magical pre-existing Middle Earth universe that he adapted. He invented it with bits and pieces of things that he really liked. So I think it's super important to cast that net as broadly as you can and bring as many things into it as you can, especially if you're writing genre fiction. So earlier I mentioned, you know, Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is, you know, hilarious, but most people would not say it had much to do with science fiction or fantasy. And other people, you know, just Kurt Vonnegut and, you know, P.G. Wodehouse, for God's sakes, you know, who was writing in the 20s and 30s. But the thing is the more influences you have, the more individual your voice is going to be. So that's super important, is, you know, don't just read fantasy novels and then write fantasy novels. Read all kinds of things from all different kinds of eras. See how the language is developed. That also helps in fantasy, because then you have a feeling of how to write in cultures that are not exactly the same as ours, you know, because you have models. You have models of what a pre-industrial society thought and said, because people were writing books back then. So there's all kinds of things like that that I think are very helpful. The only other thing I can say, really, is that you have to learn how to sort of bi-level as a writer. You have to learn how to think as the writer, as the creator, but you also have to be able to think like the person reading the book. And that sounds straightforward, but it's not actually. You have to be able to step in and out of those two persona. You have to be able to think like the creator and like, okay, well, this will happen and then that'll happen, but let's bring this theme up so that when it does happen, I've established it, and, you know, all that kind of directorial stuff. But you also have to be able to think, okay, I'm just the reader. I'm reading this now. What do I think? What is my impression? What do I think is going to happen next? Am I satisfied with this? Am I grumpy because I'm not getting a resolution, et cetera, et cetera? So that's another thing that's just repetition. A lot of this stuff is just doing it and stripping away the unnecessary stuff, or actually some of it's even, you know, the harmful habits. Just strip them away, write frequently. It doesn't always have to be the same day or time or anything, but just regularly. Because if you know you're going to write regularly, you're also going to be thinking regularly about what you're writing. And that is just as important. I firmly believe this. You know, you have to do some of the work before you sit down in front of a keyboard. That, at least for me, I find it's just very daunting to sit down without an idea. And invariably, if I do, I write crap. You know, I'm good enough. I'm a professional for long enough now. I can write crap that sort of sounds like it's real, but I know it hasn't arisen organically out of my process. You know, the things don't jump. The characters don't come up with those great comments that just fix something in somebody's mind, or, you know, you don't have a scene that allows you to do 2 or 3 things at the same time. And those are the kind of things that come from being able to think about what you're working on and kind of pile levels of detail on top of each other, or plan ahead for what's going to happen. So writing regularly and being able to think regularly before you write are both also super important. Beyond that, it's really just, it's a question of just doing it and doing it and doing it until you find the voice that feels right to you.
Those are really, really good points. That's definitely like what I hear a lot in, like, you know, little different ways. You know, if you're going to write something, read some romance, read some Western, read a sci-fi, but I'm writing fantasy, and you could find some like awesome inspiration out of a random Western that you could adapt into your fantasy, and then, just like you're saying, you get a better richness out of your own words and things that you're crafting.
Absolutely. And one of the other things too, I'm sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't mean to.
Nope. No, you're good. I'll end up wandering in words if you don't.
You're welcome to wander. I like wandering. The other thing too that's super crucial about that is that there are, never mind. I lost the point. It'll come back to me. So,
okay. So for you to gain the point back, I'm going to do a tiny little pause for a spotlight, and then we will get back on the conversation. This week's spotlight is on The Navigator's Children, The Last King of Osten-Ard, Book 4 by Tad Williams. The latest saga in the New York Times best-selling world of Osten-Ard concludes in the 4th and final Last King of Osten-Ard novel. And I'm just going to aside, I'm sorry if I pronounce any of these wrong. I'm doing my best. The Heorot is besieged by the Norns, once the home of their immortal brethren. The Scythy, now capital of the Kingdom of Men. The fabled castle is under attack. And as the world is distracted by this strike against humankind, the Norns' deathless witch queen, Utuku, turns toward the mysterious fateful valley called Tanakiru, the Veil of Mists. Meanwhile, Queen Miriamel hurries to save the Heorot and capture the treacherous noble Passavels, but arrives to discover the traitor has escaped. And inside Tanakiru, Veil of Mists, the bond between Prince Morgan and Nezeru, a renegade Norn, has become something deeper and stranger than either of them could have anticipated. They journey ever deeper into the heart of the valley's mystery, encountering wonder and horror, and come face to face at last with the ancient secret that has kindled the Norn Queen's war, a secret that will destroy immortals and humans alike. Launches November 12th. Get it on pre-order today. Link in the comments. Click buy now.
You did very well with all those names. You did very well with all those. You did very well with all those names. Yes. Very well indeed. Not that I worry about it. I'm always telling people that, like, I mispronounce the names, so why should I get offended if anybody else did? But you did a really good job, so congrats.
I did. I spun them things phonetically as hard as I could, man.
There you go. Good job.
It'll also take you to the book page where you can get 1, 2, and 3. Since that number 4 is on a pre-order, make sure you get caught up.
Don't forget to get the bridge book. There's a book in between.
There's actually there's
Memory,
actually,
Sorrow, and Thorn.
You're right, Ken. Except there's actually 2. I'm doing the heavy metal horns. There's actually 2. There's the Heart of All Regret. No, we changed the name. The Heart of What Was Lost. which is the book that technically, I guess, comes between the last book of the first series and the first book of the new series. But then just more recently, I've done Brothers of the Wind, which actually has stuff that is another short book, but it will actually feed into a lot of things happening in the last volume, The Navigator's Children. So
I love how it's labeled as a novella, but it's actually, my wife read it and she was laughing. She's like, it's the size of a regular book.
I know. I can't help it. I keep trying
she
to write.
minded it one bit. She enjoyed it.
It's the worst kind of career management you can imagine. You know, it's like, hey, I'm going to get paid the same amount whether I write a 300-page book or an 1,100-page book. So why don't I write an 1,100-page book and really divide the money into smaller and smaller pieces, you know? But I can't help it.
Josh Hayes does.
Yeah, no, the book wants to be what the book wants to be. The story wants to be what the story wants to be, and that's just kind of how it is. And I am thinking I'm not going to write too many more really long series, just because, you know, this one's been now almost 10 years I've been involved with this one, because we had COVID and I had a shoulder surgery operation, and we had my publishers taking a couple of years to change their situation because they left Penguin Random House and they're now with Astra. They're still DAW Books, but they're now with another parent company. And so a lot of things have happened to slow this down. But, you know, there's only so many times you can start off on a 10-year project in a lifetime. So I may try and write a few short books just to get some of the ideas out of my head. So we'll see.
Well, I bet your audiobook readers really love these longer novels, because we only get one measly credit. So we're going to spend it on something good and long to get us through that month.
Well, I don't stint. I don't stint. That's certainly true.
I'm curious if I can ask. I know it's been 20 years, I think, since Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn ended. And what was it like? Or I guess maybe the question is, when did the idea come to you that maybe there's another story here I want to tell?
There's a story about telling the story. And that story is, as I mentioned before, my wife is a book person. She was a very good publisher long before we had a romantic relationship. So, you know, I can say without fear of being accused of favoritism that I always thought she was a really excellent publisher. She also is more of a business head than I am, is more interested in that stuff. And one of the things she would say to me when I'd be sort of between projects is, well, you know, why don't you go back and write another book set in Ostenard? Because that's, you know, we get emails and requests for that all the time. Yeah. And initially my reasons had been, you know, I never want to do the same thing twice, not ever. And as I got older, I wrote a couple of short stories set in various of the worlds that I'd already created and things like that, and realized that's kind of, you know, that's a bit pretentious, I think, saying that. But what I did say to her at the time, she would say, so why don't you write another Ostenard book? There's an audience out there for it. And I would always say, you know, it doesn't work that way. These aren't franchises. I can't just make another Ostenard book. I have to have the story first. And it has to be a story I want to tell, because first of all, it's going to take me years. You know, this is a huge commitment of my life. I don't want to just jump into it unless I'm going to really like it, because it's hard to like something when you're on like year 6 or year 7. You know, it's like you want anything other than to be
a million times.
Absolutely. But so anyway, Deborah and I were having one of these discussions, and I went to bed that night thinking, you know, she doesn't understand that, you know, why I don't just write something, that I have to have the idea first. So I'm lying there in bed, and as one sometimes does when one has had a discussion with one's partner, I'm thinking of all these things that I should have said and should have told her to explain my position, you know, because of course anybody who understood my position would completely agree with me. Very common partner thought in the middle of the night.
Very Simon.
Yeah. And so as I'm lying there, I'm thinking, well, one of the things I didn't even get a chance to tell her is that, you know, I wrote those books back in the late 80s and very early 90s. So, you know, I'm a completely different person now. I mean, you know, my first marriage ended. I moved to England. I married Deb. We've had kids. We've raised kids. You know, I'm just not the same person. And therefore, it would be very difficult to come up with a story that would resonate with those characters. But then as I was lying there thinking that, I said, I wonder what would have happened for those characters in that same amount of time, you know, like 30 years. What happens after Happily Ever After in these big stories, you know, where everything climaxes and the, you know, the good guys have defeated evil or whatever, you know, the premise is, what about when real life starts over again? You know, what's that like? And yeah, and that was the fatal first step down the down the stairwell to the basement. You know, it's like in the dark, kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. All of a sudden, there I was sitting at the bottom of the metaphorical stairs, going, "Oh crap, that's my story." You know, it's 30 years have passed. What's going to happen? And that really is where it came from. So I was literally trying to talk my wife out of asking for another Ostenard book, and in wound up talking myself into it instead, because very quickly, as I started to think about these characters, I went, well, they'd still be going strong, but they would have had problems, and these people would have done this, and what about this particular political or magical strand from the first books? And when you work on a thing, as long as I worked on the Ostenard books the first time through, you know, you've got a whole kind of web of associations in your brain with the characters and the events and all that. And interestingly, it doesn't really go away. And I was able to tap into that very quickly and feel like I was dealing with characters that I already knew well. I didn't have to relearn them or anything. I had to relearn a lot of facts because, you know, I hadn't read them for 30 years.
Little bits.
Fortunately for me, I had friends and readers who were rereading the books religiously in the same way that I used to read The Lord of the Rings or something when I was younger. And as a result, I could contact them in the middle of the night, send them an email, you know, and go like, I really want to use so-and-so, right? You know, do you think so-and-so would work well in this bit? And they'd go, you killed so-and-so off instead of well.
That's what I was wondering. Is he alive?
Yeah, exactly. So fortunately for me, I've always got dozens and dozens of extra characters. So that's another reason to have lots of minor characters. You can always grab another one and go, okay, well then it's so-and-so. They're still alive, right? Okay. But yeah, so that's really how it happened. I was just kind of trying to explain to Deb, and I wound up talking myself into it, because once the story idea comes and it begins to develop some momentum and starts to roll down the hill like a snowball, you know, you just either get on it or you get out of the way. And that's really what happened. And so within a few days after that, I was contacting Betsy and DAW and saying, I think I'm going to do another Ostenard book. And they were kind of, where did that come from? We've been begging you for years. I went, sorry.
Well, I think it's the time and the story has to come to you, right? I think it's probably, I mean, if you, not to spoil, I'm not spoiling it for you, Lauren, because you got to listen to the books. But the climactic ending to that series, the first series, is so much that you need time to build the next, the coming climax of this series. So,
well, and it is a bit, you know, it's a bit like a James Cameron movie or something, which is that you set a certain bar of, in the Cameron case, like, you know, special effects and stuff like that, you know, you set a certain bar, and then the audience or readership is going to be disappointed if you don't give them some you know, some approximation of what you did in the first one. So I could have, but I'd written a couple of small short fictions, but that's a different issue entirely. But I knew if I was going to go into another big multi-volume story, it had to have that kind of framework. It had to have big bones, you know, to have a lot of story on it, just like the first ones did. So, and that's what I hope we've done, where that's what I'm working on. I'm in the process actually finishing right this moment. I'm literally on the last kind of bits of making the times match up in the manuscript and stuff like that. So I think I've managed that, but won't be for me to judge. But yeah, that's, you know, you have a responsibility. The readers are going to expect something. They're not going to want, you know, after the first one is all Sturm und Drang and explosions and dragons and fairies and whatnot, you know, you don't want to do a parlor drama for the second 3-4 book series. You know, that's just, people are going to be upset about that. So that's actually the only, I oftentimes wish that I could start each book as a new writer just in the sense that nobody would be expecting anything, and therefore I could literally go wherever I wanted to go. Now, probably not a good business decision, but it definitely would give me a sort of feeling of freedom that I didn't, because when I started these books, the new series, the what we're calling The Last King of Ostenard, I was really concerned, that I might go back to, because I had these friends and readers who were telling me how important the books had been to them, and I'd known them for years, and they had read them when they were teenagers, and it had formed their lives, or this things they said to me. I was like, oh my God, what if I start this new series and I screw it up somehow? Because not only will I be screwing up the new books in the next 10 years of my life, but I'll be screwing up the old books that everybody already liked. I'll have ruined it for them, like when you find out that, Bill Cosby was a sexual predator. I can never listen to another, not that I was going to turn out to be a sexual predator, but that, that I might do the books wrong in some way. And then everybody who had loved the old books would have that shadow over them and go like, oh, I can't really enjoy it anymore. So I was like, oh my God, because I can't listen to Bill Cosby records anymore. I
think there's a level of trust, though. I mean, you haven't handed the story off to anybody else yet.
Yeah,
so
losing
at
track
least
of
a lot
details.
of the readers would be like, we know at least we'll get this.
I would hope so, but I definitely worried about it. So really, it wasn't until the first book came out and the reviews started coming in and readers started contacting me and they said, oh my God, it's Simon and Miriamel. I totally get them. That's exactly who they'd be, et cetera. And I went, oh, okay. So whatever else I failed to do or do wrong, I haven't mangled the characters that everybody was invested in, and Benedict is back and, everybody was fine with him and et cetera, et cetera. So that was what I was concerned about. And I really was concerned with it because I'm a worrier, It's like I find things to worry about.
Now, did you take any steps in your process to bring all the universe details together? Patricia Gillum asked, do you keep an internal series Bible just for yourself? Or I guess, is it something like on your computer or written down or a wiki? Any tips for keeping things organized with a larger series? Because you've got a big universe with history and characters and details and places and stuff. How do you do it?
I think I am slightly unusual in that I keep more of that stuff in my head than most people do. Because for me, I find that when I start to write things down, they start to solidify, and I have to do a lot of playing around with ideas as I go because I'm writing these many-stranded plot lines, which all kind of have to weave together and come together at the right times and all that. And they're all moving at different rates and have different things happening at different times. So as soon as I write something down, it tends to feel like it's halfway to being cast in stone, that it's like there and you can't change it. So the more fluid I'm able to leave things, which does sound indeed like I've got water on the brain, but I don't mean it that way. Just the more flexible I am able to be while I'm working, the more I can change things quickly around and feel like, yeah, that didn't work. Let's toss that out. Let's try it this way. So I rely on my memory more than most people, but even so, I do have to have things. One of the things I do is I have a running abstract, as I call it, which is just chapter by chapter and the focal point characters. That's what I call them. The characters through whose eyes we are seeing or over whose shoulder we are looking, if you're not privy to their thoughts. I have an abstract by chapters that tells you like, so chapter 1 is so-and-so, and this is what happens, just a little half a sentence. And then the next bit is so-and-so and another half sentence and like that. Now, one of the main reasons this is valuable is if you write big books like I do, and you've got a 1,200-page manuscript, which is what I have with The Navigator's Children, it takes a while to find things, just the simple, you're remembering, I know that so-and-so said that, and I've got to go back and fix that to jibe with what I'm doing right now that I've just changed. So I have to go back and change all the earlier references to that thing so that they all match. Well, if you have to go through the entire manuscript again to find that, and you have to do that 20, 30, 40, 100 times during the process of rewriting, you're in trouble. So the abstract is useful that way. It's also, if you remember, I said something earlier about being able to stand back. It's a tool for helping you to step back from the manuscript and see it as a whole, you know, like on one page of paper, and you can see, okay, here in the early part, there's all these kind of action sequences, and then it goes kind of spare of action for a while, and then, okay, more action sequences, but I'd like to bring one of those back a little bit just to kind of make it less on and off and more of a continuum, or, you know, that kind of stuff. It allows you to look at the book as a whole as you're working on it. That coupled with whatever outline you do in the first place, and I do some outlining, mostly because when I'm starting a story, I know that the first couple of volumes are going to be already out and published before I'm writing the ending. So I have to know something of what's going to happen in the ending, just so I can foreshadow in the first couple of volumes. You have to treat that like it's all one story, and the beginning is setting things up. But you can't set things up if you have no idea what's going to happen at the end. So that's where I part from George R.R. Martin's, you know, are you an architect or a pantser? I'm not a pantser. I don't fly by the seat of my pants. I do in individual scenes or something. But in terms of the overall structure, I need that architecture so that I know that I'm going to give people what they need at the ending. And then I know all these things are going to line up, and that most critically, that I have foreshadowed enough that even though I don't ever want the readers to actually guess what's going to happen, what I do want is I want the readers to be smacking themselves on the head and going, why didn't I see that? Of course, it was so-and-so all along, you know, and you do that by foreshadowing and setting up these little puzzles. Even sometimes if you don't know yourself the exact truth, you can fudge your way around that and make it suitably mysterious that when the reader gets to the reveal, they'll go, oh, that's what that was, not realizing that you didn't actually know either when you wrote it, you know. But
so when you're starting these outlines, because this is one thing that I get a question I get a lot is how to outline. What are you like number one focusing on? Like when you jump in, some people will be, you know, figuring out who their characters are and who they are in the world. Some people will be like the whole world. And they kind of have to be careful not getting lost in like world building. So where is your like initial focus, and how do you keep from getting lost in the world building?
That's a really good question. That I think the main thing is you have to start with story. And when I say that, what I mean is, what is the story? Why are you telling this? Why are you making this thing in the first place? You know, what is it that you want to accomplish? And that means you have to think a little bit about what is motivating you and what is going to motivate the reader. And maybe it is the idea of the characters learning and growing and becoming the people that the readers hope they will become, or failing to become those characters that they hoped, or whatever. Or maybe you're saying this is, this is a bit of a metaphor for our current state of affairs in the world, and therefore I want the readers to be thinking, okay, so the writer is worried about this, that, and the other thing. And whatever it is, you need to figure out what your story is about and start from there, because an outline is the skeleton of telling the story. So you have to know at least a little bit about why you're telling a story and what story you're telling before you start. A plot is not a story. Okay, that's a super important thing to understand. He goes here, she goes there, she goes here, he goes there. That's not a story. That is a plot. Those are a series of plots. The story is really, what is it about? And for instance, a lot of my fiction is about family. It's about the unreliability of history, because history tends to be written by winners, and the losers tend to get pushed out of the picture or utterly changed. It's about it. The Ostenard books were very much about my reaction to the way other people were writing fantasy. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write one, because I saw a lot of people, as I mentioned, taking Tolkien just as whole and saying like, well, that's the fantasy world. It has to be, you know, the same as Tolkien with the tall, beautiful elves and the short, grumpy dwarves and the this and the that, not realizing that Tolkien had chosen those things because they pushed forward the story he wanted to tell. They were not absolutes. They were choices out of myth and history and his own mind. So you got to know what it is that you're trying to do before you start trying to come up with a plot, because plot is just a way to move characters around. You know, that is not a reason to read a book in and of itself. Individual bits of it may be exciting or wonderful or clever, but it's not why you stick with a book all the way to the ending. You become invested in characters and the resolution of certain situations and things like that. So that's the first thing. Okay, know what you're writing about and why. Then the next most important thing is to figure out who are the characters who are going to carry this. It may be your main characters, should be oftentimes your main characters, but it may not be. You know, I mean, in the sense that in The Wizard of Oz, the wizard is very important through the whole story, but is hardly in it at all. But you had to have that wizard in there for a number of reasons, because he makes a lot of things happen, both by commission and omission. So you need to know who your important characters are and build your outline around them. Everything else is subordinate. Everything else is secondary. Everything else can be moved around. Your main characters, though, have to have a reason for doing the things they're doing. And that's kind of the third part, is as you're writing your outline, if you're not sure about why something is going to happen, don't force it. Give it time. It'll come to you. Just say, I need, you know, as you're writing your outline, say, and I need this person to go from here to here. I don't know why yet. I mean, you don't have to literally write that down, but if you try to force things too early, you will find that you are coming up with really second, third rate kinds of reasons for things to happen. Whereas if you wait till you get there, you may suddenly realize, this character is the kind of person who would absolutely do this, not that. But that can take me into, you know, what I wanted them to do. So I'll just do it in this slightly different way. So I'd say those are the main things, is just know more about what you're actually writing and what you actually want that story to do for the readers, how you want them to feel as they're reading it, and why you want them to continue reading, if that makes sense.
So from an author's perspective, you know, you want to really grasp onto that theme, you know, family, hate, love, whatever the theme is, and then grasp onto the characters that can deliver the theme, the lessons, you know, what's being learned, and then what kind of world that can all be delivered in, which is really, you know, if you want to write a fantasy, how can that be shown in a fantasy? If you want to write a Western, how can that theme be shown in the Western? How would these different characters, exist in this world with their own personalities? I find that interesting because more often I hear, you know, authors, they start with the character first, which is why I really wanted to ask that. Is a lot of people, it's like, well, character is the most important. You know, start with the characters. They're the ones that are going to tell you what the story is about and all that. But yours is the direct opposite. What's the theme? What's the emotion that you want to deliver? Do you want people to be laughing the way through? Do you want them to be crying at the end? And like, honestly, that emotion behind it really can change the type of characters that you bring into the story. And it will definitely change how, you know, these the different, you know, plot devices that you use are tackled, because those different people react differently. So I think, I like that different perspective. It's like the same side. It's like the same coin, but a different side of the coin.
Yeah. Well, and I hasten to say that one of the things we always have to be careful about is that what works for some people in the creative fields, but really in any field you name, what works for some people doesn't work for others. So, you know, when I say this is what I think you should do, what I'm really saying is this is what works for me. And people will find their own way. But I absolutely agree with you that the idea that starting with the characters and that they'll find the story I'm sure that does work for some people, but it also can lead you into a situation where you spend all of your time making these really interesting, likable characters, but the story doesn't carry you forward or whatever. And as I was saying about the newer Ostenard books, I already knew the characters. I knew the characters perfectly well, but I didn't have a story I wanted to tell. And that's the last part of finding your story that's important, is it doesn't just have to carry the readers through. It has to carry you, the writer, through as well. You have to get up on those days when you feel like crap and you really don't want to work. And you have to go, I will go and find out something about my story today because I'm still interested in it, even though I'm not interested in working, you know? And
I find that you've developed the character. Like you said, you know the characters so well. You've also understand how they evolve and grow, like the way Simon and Miriam interact versus Sisquinamuk and Benedict interact, you know, as very close relationships, right? And you don't see that quite as often. At least I haven't read that a lot in fantasy, in more modern fantasy, that not just developing relationships, but long-lasting relationships is something that is definitely in this series very strong.
Well, that was exactly when I had that kind of epiphany about what I was going to write. That's exactly what it was, is I realized, like, I've been now living with my wife since 1992. You know, we have this long, wonderful, slightly sometimes complicated, you know, history between us, in the sense that we're both very strong-minded people, and there's only two of us and nobody gets to outvote the other. You know, that's a really interesting set of dynamics, you know, and I wanted to see how would Simon and Miriam, I mean, they were like 15 and 16 when they get together. That's incredibly young by our standards these days. How would they be in their 40s and 50s, you know? And that became a big motivation for me to want to explore that. And both from the point of view of saying, any human being of any era, you know, here are the complications of personal relationships, but also saying, and here's how those relationships might play out in this invented world that we've already visited before. So yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that going back to something earlier that we were talking about, when the gentleman from Library Ladder, his name Bridger, I think, or Richard Bridger, anyway, when he was talking about the late to his own revolution thing with me, that was one of the things I think that I can say that I don't think I by any means the first, but I did bring to the field was, I think I brought a certain fascination with real people to the epic fantasy form as it was when I got into it, you know, is that I said, I am not doing what Tolkien did because that's not me, you know, and what Tolkien did was brilliant, but it was Tolkien. I am not writing characters loosely kind of based on heroic myths for Europe, right? I am writing something more contemporary. And one of the things that's of my generation is really examining how people get along with each other and how people motivate themselves and how they change and all of these things, rather than being sort of more static characters of heroic myth and epic poetry. And as a result, you know, that's really where I focused from the very beginning, is these interactions between characters and the growth of characters and all that. Not saying I did it well or anything, but it is something that I think that I kind of put a very strong emphasis on it. And that may be what they're talking about when they say I had influence in the field. I'm very interested in people. I always have been.
I think that also adds to the culture of it, right? Because the characters exist in their cultures too, so they bring their culture as a person with them, which is a part
absolutely.
Of the world.
And this also goes back to something you said, Lauren, when you were asking about, you know, how do you write? How do you do these things? And one of the things that I find is very useful, but like Ken said, is to say, okay, who are these people? Let's get into them. Let's say, how were they raised? What was their background? What were their expectations? What kind of eschatological training did they have for how the universe works? You know, what kind of religious instruction or non-instruction did they get, and all those kinds of things. And what you find is what I call sort of the emergent complexity of things, is that you find that the more you think about those things, the more they begin to work, the more they begin to make sense, because you're building the whole thing that way. You're connecting things side to side as you're adding things on. So as a result, if you make one character true to who they should be in those circumstances, then their interactions are going to affect how other characters are and help you to think about those other characters. And you're building a more realistic world over time by taking each character seriously. And for that reason, this is just a personal thing. If I have a minor character, but they're focal point, they're people whose eyes you look through, or who, as I said, you look over their shoulder, I feel obligated to give them an entire arc of their own, even if they're only like the 7th or 12th most important character. If I have started with them as somebody that the reader is experiencing the story through, I have to treat them like they are the hero of their own story, because everybody is the hero of their own story. Lauren, you are. Ken, you are. Eileen, you are. We all are the heroes of our own story. And that's how we see the universe, is everything's happening around us and to us and because of us or for us or against us. So it's an important part of writing, because as soon as you start breaking characters down in that way, you begin to connect into all kinds of other parts of the world that you're building, and you develop new appreciation, and you find new things, and you think of new things, and you start asking yourself questions. Well, this guy grew up in the swamp, and, he spent all of his time around water and all that. But on the other hand, and now he's living somewhere totally different. How would he feel about that? How would the people that I know who made those kind of life changes feel, and stuff like that? And it starts to lead you into these useful new ways of looking at your characters, and it makes the background and the world building more dense. And you can't help it. It's not, you don't have to set out to think expressly, how do I build this world? You're building it character by character and experience by experience. You have to do some stuff at the beginning, but from that point on, you are building around the characters and making them real, and that makes the world real.
Yeah, I noticed those POV shifts right from the start of book 1. It's sort of like a rose kind of opening up, because each petal is like a different POV, and then as they kind of circle out, you get more of a sense of what's going on in the plot and what this world is. There isn't an info dump, but you have different characters adding another piece of the puzzle and kind of building off each other. And I can see where that is one of those ways you can like lay down those clues about what's happening like later on in the book. But from different characters' point of view, they're giving their perspective, their side, and sometimes they perceive the truth wrong. They could get something wrong, or they could be telling their story a certain way, like kind of slanting the truth because of where they're coming from or what they're trying to accomplish. And then the reader could later on reread that chapter and go, oh, so that's what was going on the whole time.
Yeah, if every character is an unfaithful narrator, then the reader has to do their own work. And that was one of the things that I decided early on in the Dragonbone Chair. And again, it was a reaction to the post-Tolkien writers, not Tolkien himself, because as I said, he was making his own choices to tell the story. But one of the things that Tolkien does, and obviously did it even more in The Hobbit than he did in The Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien has a narrative voice and presence in The Lord of the Rings. And it is essentially kind of the voice of God. It is telling you what is happening or what is true or how a character felt. And there is never a point at which you go, well, I don't think I actually believe that, because it's the narrative voice. It's Tolkien's voice telling you, and that's fine. I have no complaint with that. But I grew up and live now in a much different world where we are, if anything, inundated, overwhelmed by divergent viewpoints on things. And one of the things that I really wanted to do, and I've done in most of my books, is let the reader put together their truth out of as many different subjective takes as possible, because that not only does that allow you to do what you said, which is that you begin to have to make your own decisions about what's true and what's not true, but it also gives you a way to look to examine the entire world you've created without having a narrator telling people, well, this is this country and the people from here do this and they are like this and they are, and instead you're looking at a person who actually lives there and you're hearing what they think. And it may be trustworthy, it may not be trustworthy, but it's from ground level. It's not a narrator telling you what to think. It's you as a co-participant with that character, and you're deciding for yourself, is this person trustworthy? Is their experience valid? And you're learning about this world firsthand because you're learning it from someone who lives in it rather than someone who's describing it from a godly viewpoint. So, I think all of those ways of approaching storytelling are very, very much a part of what I came to realize was going to be my style. Again, because of the world that I live in. I don't live in a world of certainty. I don't live in a world of godlike narrators. I live in a world where every voice is clamoring to be heard, even the crazy ones. And you have to swim through a tide of contradicting opinions just to find anything.
Well, the ironic thing is actually there's two versions of The Hobbit, because Tolkien, he went on to write Lord of the Rings, and then he's like, oh, I gotta change the riddles in the dark scene.
Right. Yeah.
Supposedly the Hobbit is written by Bilbo later. And he didn't, and he kind of fibbed and tweaked with the truth the first time he wrote the book, and then later the true real version came out, and Tolkien just incorporated that into his lore and went on. But so you're saying, like, one of the things that you really kind of contributed to fantasy is you wanted to bring out the different perspectives and the different voices and like weave that into your plot, or you were using the illustration of architecture, having like a blueprint, a 3D kind of plot story that's built on all of these different perspectives that's leading to a big conclusion at the end. Where do you see the fantasy genre going now? Like, how is it shifting and changing now? That's kind of how it's been shifting the past years. Sure. Where's it going next, do you think?
Well, at my exalted age, I should probably say, oh, it's all going to hell. It's terrible. But, I obviously I don't feel that way at all. I'm not necessarily the right person to ask, though, because I am not reading that much these days, except nonfiction, because just, the responsibilities of writing these big, long, complex stories has taken up more of my reading time than it used to. But basically, I think the main change now is the I don't want to say backlash, but the move away from the centering of European Western civilization and especially of Northern European myth and folklore as being the boundaries of most fantasy. Now that started a while back, and there's always been, elements of it in fantasy and science fiction, I'm glad to say, but it's certainly, when I wrote the Otherland books, which are my sort of semi-science fiction, very much this was an issue for me as well. And I never particularly liked that. I never liked that white American guys save the universe thing in science fiction. And I never particularly thought that the only interesting folklore was Norse and Celtic folklore or also. Now, because to begin with, I was writing in the sort of vaguely Tolkienian style or ideology of, a Europeanized universe. Then I kind of wound up now, since I'm still writing in this world years and years later, I kind of made my own bed and I had to lie in it. But personally, I'm thrilled that people are bringing other viewpoints. And that's not just in terms of actual cultures, although that's a big part of it, but in terms of different life experiences, more gay viewpoints, more third world viewpoints, more, gender confused viewpoints, all kinds of things, and frankly, I always think that kind of thing is good. I think the more different approaches that people bring, it's like what I was saying earlier, Lauren, about writing in general. you cast your net wide. You do that as an individual, as a writer, but a field needs to do that as well and bring in as many different voices as possible, because a lot of stuff comes that we don't even see when it's happening. You don't even notice it. I mean, I didn't notice when I was reading Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light in the 1970s, that he was introducing me to all kinds of interesting things about Indian culture and the Hindu religion at a great remove. I mean, his characters aren't even Indian. They've just stolen, the Hindu myth cycle to subjugate the people on this planet. But it got me fascinated, and now that happened to be, another white guy writing about another culture that was being used badly by presumably more white guys on some distant colony planet. But it led me into this stuff, and I wound up reading, the Mahabharata and all these kinds of Indian mythology because of that. It got me into it. So the wider that you make your web of resource and your capture field of what you're going to put in your writing, or what a field is going to put in its writing, as far as I'm concerned, the better it is. And that I do see, and I'm totally in favor of it. I am not serious. I'm honestly not one of those grumpy old guys who says, oh, it's not exactly the same as it was when I was younger. Thank God, thank God things change. So that's my main thought about contemporary fantasy, is that I love the diversity that we're getting now. And I've enjoyed, Nnedi Okorafor, people like that who are writing really interesting stuff that is from a completely different viewpoint than I could ever muster. I don't have her background. Lots of other writers too who are like that. So yeah, I'm happy about that. I think it's very healthy.
So what I'm hearing is, as an author, don't be afraid to create new boundaries. It's not what someone 30 years ago did. That's not the only gateway. You can build a new gateway and explore it.
Absolutely. And here, actually, I'll add back to when we were talking about how do you write and, what the best way to write is earlier. I will add this onto it, which is a lot of times, I don't know if this is as true as it used to be, but in the old days, people always used to come up to me and say, well, how do you figure out what's going to sell? How do you figure out what is going to get published and what people are going to want to read, et cetera, et cetera? And what I used to always tell them is, basically, that's the wrong way to go about it. I'm firmly convinced what you have to do is you first of all, you have to refer to a reader's viewpoint. And let's face it, the only reader's viewpoint any one of us actually knows is our own. Everything else is supposition. Everything else is second or third hand. So my feeling is, as a writer, you must write the book you want to read. And then you hope that there are enough other readers like you out there to actually buy some copies and keep you from starving and taking your family to go live under the underpass in an old refrigerator box. But, that's crucial, because you're the only person who can judge when you're writing something, whether it feels good or not, whether it feels like you'd enjoy reading it. If you're trying to write to an imaginary audience, an imaginary reader, you're just guessing. If you're trying to beat a trend, first of all, you're a couple of years behind the fact if you're basing it on what's on sale now, because what's on sale now was decided several years ago when they bought those books, right? So, unless you're literally in the field, you can't know what's selling at the moment. And even some people in the field don't know. So what you got to do is you rely on the one reader who you hope is not going to lie to you, which is yourself. And you write that book that you want to read. And then from that point on, you hope that there are others like you. But if you try to write to an imaginary reader, or God forbid, to a marketing trend, it just is not going to work very well, I don't think. I stunned them into silence.
I think the fantasy realm is a little bit more, I would say, forgiving as far as allowing you to explore different areas and different genres, things that are not in trend, right? You can
Yeah.
write a book that is Indian inspired or African inspired and be okay with it, right?
Well, you can now. It was more difficult some years past, which is why I'm so happy to see it happening. But no, you're right. We are more forgiving. Let's face it, we're like the theater people of literature. That's what fantasy and science fiction is. And I say this without joking, because when we were raising our kids, you know, if we had been out going to more cons and stuff like that at the time, I would have happily let my kids be raised by the science fiction and fantasy community, because it tends to be a very open-minded, inclusive community in general. But since that wasn't available at the time, because we weren't traveling much, you know, I shoved them off to theater instead, because it's the same thing. It's basically where people will like you if you're fun and funny, you know, and you don't have to have a certain kind of clothes or drive a certain kind of car, you know. So yeah, it's one of the things I love about fantasy and science fiction. There is a reason that, you know, we are off to one side of these things, and that is because we do tend to be more open-minded to weird ideas. And as a result, you know, there are times when, you know, people will go like, oh, all those weirdos who read fantasy novels. Well, yeah, but we're weirdos who read, which already makes us a cut above a lot of the people out there. You know? So not to brag on us or anything, but, you know, I mean, let's face it, readers are just generally better prepared to deal with life than non-readers.
So write the book you love, because, like I saw in a tweet recently, you're going to have to read it 75 times before it's done. And but put it out there, get your voice out there, and it'll find friends. It'll find people who love it, want to read it too. If you know, if not, but you still love writing, keep going, keep trying, keep making those characters. Bringing in different stories to tell, and tell your story through the words that you have.
Last thought on that, which is that a lot of people, I think, have this thing of like, well, if you don't get published, you failed. The fact is that writing, if you write frequently, regularly, writing is a hugely valuable thing to do, even if you don't become a published writer. You learn things about yourself. I mean, I learned things about myself from my own writing that I never picked up in therapy. You know, it's like I look at patterns that keep coming up and I go like, ooh, somebody's got a bit of a complex there. Oh, wait, it's me, you know. And I've had people literally point out to me, my ex-wife, my first wife, once said, Tad, all of your monsters seem to come from the fact that you hate seafood. And damned if, you know, as soon as she said that, I went, God, she's right. She's right. They're all seafood based. They're all like rubbery and they got shells and they're all this stuff. So, I mean, that's obviously a fairly trivial example of learning about yourself. But I mean, no, I've found all kinds of other things too that, you know, I've realized, oh my God, this is an issue for me. It's in all my books. And I never realized it until I had written enough that I said, oh, this isn't just a fluke. This is something that comes up out of the core of my being. So yeah, that's another reason. Even if you never get published, you learn things about yourself. You become better at something. You learn to order your thoughts in a more useful and concise way. So there's a zillion good reasons to write, whether you finish a book or not.
Keep going.
And on that note, I would love to keep this conversation going. You have been absolutely delightful. I love all your little insights. You have a fresh perspective on a lot of the same questions that end up getting asked, and that's really fun. And that's honestly, that's one thing in my own writer world my head gets knocked up against the wall trying to fight through is I keep thinking so hard, it's like characters and how are they doing in their story, and then, you know, 20 renditions later, I finally figure out the story,
Yeah.
and then the characters fall into place. So if I just start with the story first, it might, the theme and the emotion, it might help a bit.
The story is the hook that pulls you through the whole thing. So if you can find that hook and attach that to your characters, you will find that you don't have to do quite as much work as you thought you did.
Yeah, find the hook and put it in the first chapter.
Yeah,
and pull them along.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
All right, and everyone out there in the chat, thank you for joining us. I know there were a couple questions in the chat that had gone on, but I mean, Tad's done so good hitting all the little notes. We didn't even like have to hit half the questions, ask half the questions in our document because he was answering them. So if your question wasn't answered, it probably was.
Yeah. Also, I'm on social media. I'm always happy to answer questions. I think all my social media is kept public, so you don't have to be, a Facebook friend or whatever they are on Twitter now. You can just come ask me a question. I'm happy to try to answer it. So if you had something that was really important to you to find out and didn't get answered, just cruise by one of my social media pages and ask me, and I'll answer it for you.
And pick up Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn and the new books.
I was going to say, yeah, pick them all up.
Sure.
What the heck, right? I mean, life is short. My books are not, but life is short.
Well, it's coming out in November, so that's going to be a great
theoretically. Yeah, the publishing industry is just 9 kinds of mess still post-COVID. So we shall see what we shall see. But as I'm basically done with it. I'm in the last few days of work before I get rid of it for good. So if it is delayed, it won't be my fault. That's all I have to say.
All right. Well, y'all heard it here. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us on your Friday evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are out there in the worldness. For Lauren Moore, Ken Britz, thank you, Tad Williams. I am Kayleen Williams. I have not done an exit intro for so long. I am bombing this so hard.
No, you're not. You're doing great. We love you.
Reading,
all right.
writing.
I don't know when we're going to be back with another show. We are going to be back. We always come back. We miss you guys. We love you. We know Josh and Scott are out there probably coming up with something at some point in the futureness. And that's what I could promise in the future. At some point, it will happen. More reading, writing, everything in between right here in Keystroke Mediums, The Writer's Journey. Peace out, you guys.